So,
This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome. Today I'm joined by Justin Borger and Samuel Brewer. Thanks for being on the program, gentlemen.
Great to be here.
yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, Samuel, this is your second time on the program, at least. So let's start with Justin. Tell us where you are at St. Paul's in Orlando.
That's where I am, St. Paul's, Orlando, PCA. Been down here since 2008. Came down to go to seminary and went to St. Paul's just looking for a church home and never left. Met my wife, Becky, and the rest is history.
So you married a Florida girl.
That's right. She's from Jacksonville. Does that count as Florida?
I don't know. That might be Georgia. It's debatable. Yes. My family and I worshipped at St. Paul's once when we were down at Rodent Land. But it's a good hike from the Rodent Kingdom there. Maybe 40 minutes.
Yes, the magical kingdom strikes back.
Yes. And so that's Central Florida Presbytery. And then Samuel Brewer, you're in Southwest Florida Presbytery. Tell us where you are. Remind us.
Yeah, right next door to them, presbytery-wise. I'm as far to the Gulf as you can get in our presbytery. So I'm in Seminole at Christ the King Presbyterian Church. So kind of St. Pete is what more people would know, I guess. But
okay, all right. I've never worshipped there. Not to say that it's bad or anything, but
it's okay.
Maybe someday we'll make it that far south or north, depending on how Florida geography works. I know it's kind of wonky. The further north you go, the further south you go in Florida. But
we're west. We're just west.
We're just west. All right. And Justin, your father was my predecessor at First Pres Fort Oglethorpe, so we know a few of the same people.
That's right. Good old Fort O.
So we've got these couple of overtures from these two Florida presbyteries. Now, not all the overtures coming out of Florida presbyteries are this good, but this one deals with the concept of an assistant pastor. Can one of you, other than the old question, what is the difference between an assistant pastor and an associate pastor, other than $10,000? How are those two roles distinct?
Yeah, so you've got maybe a technical distinction, then you could think about practical differences. But the technical difference is the call. The call of a assistant comes from a session. The call of an associate comes from a congregation. And because the congregation does not call the assistant, they do not have a vote on the session, even though they would have a vote as a member of presbytery and could vote even at the highest court of the General Assembly.
So the assistant pastor... Oh, I'm sorry.
We could think about practical differences. Assistant pastor could be fired in a single called meeting of a session. So there are practical considerations, but that's the technical.
So for an assistant pastor, you could preach a bad sermon on Sunday, and by Monday at 7:30 at night, you're out of a job. Whereas it takes at least for an associate pastor, it takes at least a week. So you got another chance to whiff it for an associate. Have either of you ever been assistant pastors?
Nope.
Yeah, I've been an intern and a bottle washer and an associate and an assistant and a good old regular pastor.
So you've done it all, Justin.
No, I went straight from seminary to this. So,
so some of I've when I was an intern at First Pres Jackson, they have usually at least a half a dozen assistant pastors. And when this overture was coming up, I was, when this concept was being discussed, I think I was still in Mississippi Valley Presbytery, even though I was a pastor at that point. And Some of them said, "Yeah, I would really like to not be an assistant pastor, but I also really like having a job."
Mm.
So uh, there is that. So this is not the first recent attempt to change assistant pastors. Last year, your presbytery sent up an overture that was referred back for perfection. How is the Central Florida proposal different this year?
Yeah, so I was the principal author of Overture 10 last year that was sent up to Central Florida through the the church session I lead, and then forwarded to GA. And I think there are some real improvements between last year and this year. I was encouraged when I sent the perfected version to Mel Duncan, who was the chairman of the OC committee, the Overtures committee last year, that referred it back to us. That he said it made a good overture better, so that was encouraging. There's an analysis at the end of the overture that the administrative committee printed where it goes through. If you go all the way down to the bottom there, you'll see a point by point analysis of every change. And that's probably the fastest way to see the differences. Some of it is more concise. It addresses some concerns that were brought to the overture last year, including a question about the arbitrariness of adding a supermajority vote. But perhaps the single biggest change is that um, this new version of the overture basically says that you have to set the terms of the call, and it has to be definite at the time when it's called, ordinarily not to exceed 5 years. And there's no provision for extending an assistant pastor call beyond the definite time that's set the first time he's called.
So if they really like him and they said, we're going to do this for 3 years, there's no option to say we're going to add another 2 years because we really like him.
That's correct.
You would say to that, well, then call him as an associate minister.
That's correct.
So, Samuel, can you just help us think about what are the principal objections to that office class of assistant pastor as distinct from an associate pastor who's a member of the session called by the congregation? What's the objection to a pastor who's just been hired by a group of 7 or 12 or 70 men on a session?
Yeah, part of the reason I was on board with this overture or overture 10 last year and then wanting to help the cause as it were is because really I think it comes down to our preliminary principles, which I think are biblical. Preliminary principle 6 is very clear that the power to elect persons to the exercise of authority in any particular society resides in that society. So if you're asking like what's the motive here, it's the people, the congregants, don't they don't have a direct say in the calling of this pastor who's exercising pastoral oversight of a particular congregation. And I think that's in violation not only of preliminary principle 6, Justin's overture points out where else it violates. And I think that's the main concern here is the congregation never had a direct say in this guy being their pastor.
Can we flip to BCO 16.2? This really puts a point on it, if that's easy to access. BCO 16-2. It's really quite something that this is on the books. This is current PCA Book of Church Order. The government of the church is by officers gifted to represent Christ, and the right of God's people to recognize by election to office those so gifted is inalienable. Therefore, no man can be placed over a church in any office without the election or at least the consent of that church.
And that seems to summarize well the principle that congregations directly wield their authority only in two instances: personnel and property. And so the calling of church officers, the election of church officers, and whether they're going to sell their worship space is
Right.
And so you would suggest that for a congregation to indirectly call and elect a man violates the principles of Presbyterianism.
Yeah, and again, it's not just because we have a fancy constitution and we like to do things a certain way. It's we actually believe these are biblically derived principles. To Acts 6, you look at the Reformed tradition, especially Calvin and them are like, no, the people have a right to call their officers. And so, obviously and I'm sure we'll get to more of these. One of the rebuttals to this is, well, the congregation does have a say because they elected the session members who hired the guy. It's like, well, maybe for staff we can count that or something, but we're talking about a pastor, right? And so that's not a sufficient voice for the people. Like that's not a sufficient right being exercised by the people to hire a lead pastor via the session, right, or an associate pastor. So that's a distinguishing thing there, where this guy's a pastor. He's not an intern. He's not a secretary or an administrator assistant. He's a pastor.
Which is something you often hear. It's interesting, some of the debate that was heard in the lead up to Overture 10 last year was, well, assistant pastors are really just glorified interns or directors of ministries. But no, they aren't. They're ordained ministers of the gospel, members of presbytery, who preach, who exercise oversight in administering the sacraments, who will actually sit at General Assembly and have a clicker in their hand and will be governing the church as they vote to rewrite or not portions of the BCO. It's been pushed back that, well, they don't really exercise governing authority. But how is it not exercising governing authority if you can moderate a presbytery, if you can chair a judicial commission? Theoretically, there's nothing to prevent an assistant pastor from being elected as the moderator of the General Assembly. They can do everything. The only thing that they can't do is vote on a local to vote on the lowest court.
Right.
And they do exercise church power, right? The officers, and they are church officers, exercise that power, sometimes severally, in the preaching of the gospel, administering the sacraments, reproving the erring, visiting the sick, comforting the afflicted, which is the power of order. And so, yes, he may not be able to exercise power along with those who are exercising it jointly or as jurisdiction on the session level. But if an assistant pastor reproves a person, that is the exercise of church power. Whereas if the director of student ministries is doing it, that's different, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, if Hebrews says obey your leaders, is an assistant pastor one of those leaders that is envisioned by Scripture to be obeyed? And I hope no one would say, no, the assistant pastors who are ordained ministers of the gospel are not in view in Hebrews' command to obey their leaders. So it's just, it's beyond reasonable debate that they exercise church power.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's just silly. It's not serious.
Well, and I don't know that anyone would say they don't exercise church power, from any serious interlocutor, at least.
Right. The pushback is. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, even if he is, the freshly, newly minted, youth pastor, ordained, he's still exercising church power.
Huh.
And yes, he may be a glorified director, but that's a huge qualifier. Glorified director. He's an ordained man to that office. So you would say that people gave their consent by delegating. Or you would say it's insufficient to have a delegated consent for the assistant pastor.
I'd say
Correct.
that's insufficient if we're going to go about it the way that we have been going about it, where there are assistant pastors who serve as assistant pastors for decades, sometimes for 20, 30 years in local congregations that have never voted on them. I would say that is a flagrant violation of Principle 6 and BCO 16-2, and more importantly, what we find in the pattern of the early church in Acts 6 and Acts 14.
Well, can you articulate, or can you talk about, are there any other Reformed and Presbyterian communions that allow for assistant pastors of this sort? I think the RPCES, I may be wrong here, but that they had assistant pastors, but that was basically an intern. But I may be remembering incorrectly. I'll have to get
so if you get into the history of this question, why do we have assistant pastors? It is bound up with the question of how do we prepare pastors, and how do we do church internship, and that has that's the backstory. And so there are other Presbyterian and Reformed denominations that have assistant pastors. If you get into the details, ARP, EPC, for example, they're not exactly the same as the PCA, but we do share a broad history of American Presbyterianism. The first time that I've been able to locate, as the overture, the whereas statements say, first time we see this in American Presbyterianism is in the 1940s. Not exactly the high point of American Presbyterianism.
What do you have against Ernst Trice Thompson?
So 1945, 19th edition of the PCUS's Book of Church Orders. This is where this first comes into codified American BCO Presbyterianism. And that was carried over into the PCA from there. And it's part of our 50-year history now. But that's the backstory. It's tied up with preparing pastors. And if we could rewrite the BCO from scratch, I would not include the assistant pastor provision. But we can't rewrite the BCO from scratch. We are where we are. And
but we did try that back in Richmond, or was it Memphis, and it failed. The rewrite of the BCO
and
after
it's an unviable way forward. So some have said to me, "Hey, your overture proves too much. If you really believe what the whereas statements say, you should just do away with the assistant pastor provision altogether." And my answer to that question is that I'm okay with incrementalism, and I'm okay with theological triage. There is no other way to do it, and it would actually be worse at this point to do away with the assistant pastor provision, because baked into our current BCO are certain presuppositions about preparing pastors and internships, which would have to be rewritten if we were going to do away with the assistant pastor provision altogether. And so this is an act of Presbyterian triage. It's keeping the main thing. And what is the main thing? Well, the main thing is our preliminary principles and moving into greater conformity. So the payoff and why people should vote for this overture is because it helps us move in the right direction towards greater conformity with our bedrock Presbyterian principles.
Well, and if you just simply erased the provision for assistant pastors, then you would have to dissolve some calls without due process, or you would impose men on a congregation without consent. And so you have to have some way to deal with it in a decent and orderly fashion.
That's right.
And your overture even explicitly states this doesn't deal with any assistant pastor call prior to next year's General Assembly if this is adopted?
I think that's really important. I mean, obviously, if you're an assistant pastor right now, okay, well, what's going to happen to me? And we need to answer that question. And
Mhm.
this overture does that, and it's one of the improvements from last year. It explicitly addresses that grandfather clause.
And Samuel,
Obviously,
your
the hope.
overture handles this
Oh,
differently, I think. Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
well, I was going to say, and the hope, obviously, there is that even with people grandfathered in, this begins to create a culture, right, of having those conversations. Like, okay, why do we have this guy here for, however long we've had him, and why aren't we moving him towards associate and giving the people their voice, if you will, to call their officers. So,
But your overture
hmm.
doesn't just grandfather them in. It says within 5 years you've got to deal with it. Is that, did I read that
Yes.
correctly?
Well, ours says within 5 years you have to deal with it, or we kind of have. So I'm not the principal author; I'm a sponsor, if you will. I had feedback into the writing of it, but it provides it's a little more incremental, and it provides a way that people could deal with the logistics of, well, it's been 5 years. For some reason, we're not quite ready to bring this person as an associate for whatever reason, and it gives, okay, that's fine, but because the ordinary expectation is 5 years, you better have a really good reason, and the presbytery really needs to buy your reason. So, hence the 2/3 majority, and this is kind of rooted in the logic of 21.4 with the exceptional circumstance clause of calling a pastor with exceptional circumstances has to be, I think, um, a supermajority of the congregation and a 3/4 vote of the presbytery. That's kind of where some of this logic is coming from. The presbytery, though, being the overseer and justifier for why you would want to extend them past the 5 years. That's the major difference, I think, between ours and Justin's, is just maybe spelling out what happens after five. You have an option after 5 years to extend them, but it's a very high bar.
And I should point out that on the Central Florida version, it's ordinarily 5 years. So theoretically, it would be possible to set the call for longer than that. You could set the call for 7 years or even 12 years if the presbytery would buy it. But part of what I've learned between last year and this year is that by setting it definitely at the time of the call for a specific amount of time, whether it's 5 years or whatever it is, we're forcing certain conversations to happen. When you hire an assistant pastor, it's going to force that church and the candidate to have a conversation, because the call is going to have to specify how long am I being called for an assistant pastor. So if you go to a church and sit down with the existing pastor and the elders, and they say, well, we'd like to call you as an assistant pastor for 20 years, that tells you something about what that church is like. We want you to be working at our church without a vote on the session for 20 years, you know? But then this presbytery is going to have to approve that, and the congregation's, going to be aware of these things. So it's going to create, as Sam said, a culture where, these conversations happen up front. And I think that will weed out this abuse of the system where we've got guys who are just serving indefinitely for decades as assistant pastors without the consent of the governed, without following our bedrock principles of Presbyterian polity.
And I think that this proposal to set the period will also change the culture, that assistant pastors will once again be either young guys fresh out of seminary, that we want a church planting resident for 3 years, and then after that you're going to go plant a church, or you're going to go sell insurance, but you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here, type of a thing. Or very, very senior men who he needs to work for the first 5 years of his retirement. So we're going to call him as the assistant pastor for senior adults or something like that for 5 years.
Yeah.
And which I think is a proper use of principially the assistant pastor role. Maybe y'all will disagree with me on that.
No, that's exactly right. So we just about a year ago we hired an assistant pastor for church planting, and we hired him for 12 to 24 months, and he knew he was going to be on staff at St. Paul's for 12 to 24 months, and we were hiring him for the purpose of raising up a core group and sending him out. And this Tuesday at our Presbytery meeting, the mission church was approved, Christ the King, and that's a wonderful use of the flexibility of the assistant pastor provision. I wouldn't write it into a BCO if I was writing the BCO from scratch, but it's, I mean, this is an extraordinary HR flexibility option that I'm glad not to do away with entirely. It's kind of a silver lining. But again, we called him for 12 to 24 months, and there was a plan. We would never call someone to serve indefinitely at St. Paul's, preaching, teaching, baptizing, marrying, bearing, counseling, and never afford the congregation the chance to vote on their leaders. We don't even do that with deacons, who arguably have less authority, but we get the model set there in Acts 6 that even when the apostles were walking the earth, they did not put leaders over the people of God without the consent of the governed. And I don't think we know better than the apostles.
Well, there are some pastors who think we need a third testament, but none of those, as far as I know, are in the PCA. So this church plant that St. Paul's is sending out, is that going to be any close to Buena Vista Drive by any chance? Because when I go to Buena Vista Drive, I have to drive like 45 minutes to get to a church. Is there any chance? Alas, no.
It will be north of the, what did you call it? The rodent
Kingdom.
Right, the rodent kingdom. There's a rat in our town.
Yes, there's a rat with lots of gastroenteritis cases that no one wants to talk about, but for some reason they have those urgent cares right outside the gates of Rodent Kingdom, loaded with Zofran, and that seems to be the only thing they have. But we digress, don't we? So from Zofran to, why do you think there is such a strong defense of the session having unqualified latitude to call or hire assistant pastors indefinitely? Is this just a reluctance to change, or is there a principial argument that you've heard, or that you could summarize, or that you could speculate on, which is of course dangerous? Why do people like this provision so much?
Yeah, I definitely want to stay away from assigning motive, but we've listed some of the reasons ourselves in terms of the utility of this position, the flexibility of this position. It affords churches and sessions latitude to be able to grow their ministries in a much easier and more efficient way. There's pragmatic reasons people like to, hey, let's bring the guy on so that congregation can get to know him. We don't have to do the pulpit committee thing then, right? And then we can have a congregational vote to move him to a social. Like, there's very pragmatic reasons, and I'm sure especially the larger PCA churches, like, that's a huge benefit to them, an asset to them, to be able to exercise those things. So there's just, I don't think it's there are some principal objections that people have made, and I'm sure we'll get to those, but there's a big pragmatic side to this that makes this kind of an uphill battle, I feel.
Yeah, I think a charitable interpretation and comments that I've heard, people have been burned. It's not uncommon, unfortunately, for a pastor and an associate pastor to get into conflict. And if that arises, multiple churches have been divided and scuttled as a result of power struggles between pastors. And it is much easier for a senior pastor and ruling elders to get rid of a problem assistant than it is to get rid of a problem associate. If we're just going to be the problem is it's not always the associates that are the problem, as we know, and sin is not especially linked to one particular class of pastor, and so um, it really is something that we've grown accustomed to, and if you operate this way for 50 years, you get used to certain ways of doing things. I think this is the reason, the HR reason why the PCA has so many big churches and the OPC does not. Why are OPC churches typically smaller and PCA churches typically, you have more larger churches? Well, if a church experiences rapid growth, they immediately need to hire more pastors to care for the church. And hiring an assistant enables you to hire quickly and fire quickly. It's very hard to hire and fire associates quickly. You don't want to give a man a vote on the session quickly. You want to know them very well before they're ensconced on a session and require a congregational vote to bring on and a congregational vote to bring off. And so there are real pragmatic factors at play. The problem is we need to be driven by principle.
Right.
And if we believe that preliminary principle 6 is in fact a bedrock principle of Presbyterian church government, that should chart the course before the pragmatics. Not because the other things aren't important, but because we are ruled by God's word.
And Ryan, can I bring up a shepherding aspect to this too? I would venture to guess there's a lot of congregants who don't know the difference between an assistant and associate. I know that was the case in my church here. When I became the pastor, we had a 14-year assistant pastor, and he's a wonderful man. He's retired now. He's here. He helps out a lot still, and I'm greatly appreciative of him. But he's honorably retired now, and the congregation didn't know the difference. A lot of people didn't, and he's pastoring. They saw him as just their pastor, and they didn't ever vote for him, right? And again, there wasn't an abuse situation in terms of he's a great man, great guy, but they didn't know what they didn't know, and they had, there was he didn't want to become an associate pastor. Actually, it had been presented to him before, I guess, but there's just a pastoral aspect too of it's our job as elders to make sure the flock knows their rights, I guess, if you will, and they have the opportunity to call their pastors.
Because that's how the Spirit ordinarily gives the church officers. He extends that call through the congregation to the man rather than through the church court. And then you get into what Thornwell warned about, this ecclesiastical tyranny, where you have men who have never been called by a congregation or haven't been called by a congregation in decades, yet they're wielding ecclesiastical authority and they're not presently called by a congregation.
It's a huge difference. When I was an assistant pastor and I went from being an assistant who was not voted on by the people I served to being an associate who was, it was a huge encouragement to know that I had been voted on not simply by the elders, but by the entire congregation. And I made an effort to actually operate in precisely the same way before and after that, because I did understand that I was a minister of the gospel even when I was an assistant. But we can't pretend that that doesn't make a difference. And it's part encouragement to the man, but it's also part honoring the rights of God's people who are called to listen to and to obey and to follow these leaders who God has placed over them with their consent.
So let's just summarize the the unique aspects to distinguish these overtures,
Hmm.
because both of them are coming from that same principle, Justin, that you highlighted, that God places leaders, officers over his church with their consent. And well, how do we square that with our current practice, which I think you're both arguing is out of accord with the biblical principles. So we've got to somehow get back to biblical principles. With the Central Florida Overture, it's an assistant for no more than 5 years. And if the desire is for longer than that, ordinarily, he has to transition to an associate pastor. There's no renewal of that assistant pastor call. But what if the session fails to dissolve that call and the congregation fails to elect? I just wonder, if nobody takes any action, then nothing changes, right?
Yeah, it would require us to actually enforce it and do it. But that's true of everything in the BCO.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the BCO, the Westminster Standards, are only as good as the men who use them as guides under Scripture to be practiced. And so that's really no different than any other thing that requires enactment. We have to do it. If a church were to call a man for, let's say they called him for 6 years at the time of his call, which they would be allowed to do under this provision, and he went past that, the the church could be dinged by presbytery as they're reviewing minutes or whatnot. But part of this is that it's going to affect the culture of the PCA, like Sam said. These conversations are going to percolate. It's going to create a new awareness of the congregation's rights, and that will have its effect.
Yeah.
And then your overture doesn't impact assistant pastors currently at all, and we've talked about that. But the Southwest Florida overture, you have a 5-year limit from installation, and then it's just automatic release. Did I read that correctly? There's no process. It's just
No.
Oh, okay.
Maybe if just to clarify, it's after the 5 years they are to be brought forward, the same as a session. If you look at lines 34 there, the 22-3, they're still, hey, bring them forward as an associate for vote. That's the whole point, is this, it really should be this natural progression to this. And so however, if the session, again, the only major difference I think between ours really is that we spell out a process for extending it beyond 5 years. So we explicitly say 5 years, whereas Justin's has actually more flexibility there too. But the controlling mechanism on that, the enforcing mechanism, is actually the same, because in Justin's, the presbytery would have to approve that call, as per normal, like all presbyteries approve all calls. In ours, it's just a capped 5 years, but then the session has to plead their case in an extraordinary circumstance. Hey, can we keep this guy on a little bit longer? It's like, okay, you can do that, but only for 3 more years, and 2/3 of the presbytery has to approve that. And then you can technically do that forever. We didn't put a limit on the amount of times you can do that. However, I functionally, I don't think that would continue in perpetuity. I think there'd be some wisdom there, but yeah, I think that's the only major difference. And to be clear, this is not an attempt to compete or anything with Justin's and the Presbytery of Central Florida. I would be thrilled if his is the one that gets passed or goes, and if Overtures chooses more of his stuff. Some of our logic was, can we kind of have multiple voices in this, and maybe control some of, or suggest some things that Overtures, if they want to amend in things, we've already got some options that we've thought through that maybe they could use. But hopefully the functional outcome of this, if it were to pass, would be the same.
And however, the only one of them is going to make it to the floor, and both of them will probably be significantly changed, or whichever one does. And so you're right. The overtures committee can draw from one to strengthen the other, or they can combine the process um, uh, easily enough.
Right.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
how would you say that this proposal substantially and significantly improves our polity? Just that it's made more biblical.
Well, it's not a small thing. Yeah, I think that really
Right.
is the big thing. It also just integrity. It aligns us with what we say already. Preliminary Principle 6 is already on the books. BCO 16-2 is already on the books. There is at least a tension, if not an outright contradiction, between our practice and our principles. So one of the downstream effects of that is, in an age where trust in institutions is at an all-time low, we can improve the health and the purity and the peace of the church by aligning practice with principle. And that has, very significant downstream benefits on the health of the church as a whole. Whenever we can do what we say, for a healthier church.
Yeah, I certainly resonate with that. One of the things that really bothers me is, when people don't have the integrity of their words. That you say that you're this.
Right.
You say that these are your principles, but here's what I see.
Right.
And of course,
Because
none
a
of us
lot of people have, sorry, a lot of people have asked, is this a solution in search of a problem? It's like, well, I don't think that's the right question at all. I think that's not even where we should be starting in that question. The question is, what are our principles, which are, we believe, faithful expressions of biblical principles? And if we are, like, we should always be kind of looking in the mirror, self-evaluating our principles to make sure they are in conformity with the scriptures, and that our practice follows our already stated principles. So I think that's the question where it should start, not utility, not have we had some kind of mass scandal of assistant pastor abuse or something. Like, that's, I think that's the wrong starting point.
We could even put just a personal note on it, as how does the Lord Jesus want his church to be run? And how do we know? And when we read the story of the book of Acts, for example, we see that, after Christ came and lived and died and rose and ascended and poured out the Holy Spirit, gave gifts to men, gave offices, that included in that, in Acts 6, is the office of the deacon, responding to the first major crisis in the early church and the outcry of the Hellenist widows. And under the wisdom of the apostles, who were eyewitnesses of the risen Christ, under their guidance, they did not simply say, well, we are going to unilaterally appoint the solution to this problem, but they gather the church, and we see the process of nomination. And while the apostles are providing oversight and making sure that these men are qualified and laying certain parameters, they involve the congregation in the selection. And then this is the underlying assumption that is carried forward in just standard Presbyterian interpretation of Acts 14, when Paul and Barnabas appoint elders. The appointment there assumes the same process that was described in detail in Acts chapter 6. That's kind of the standard Presbyterian interpretation. And so, should we not continue, as the church? Acts describes, the Gospel of Luke describes what Jesus began to do and to teach. Acts describes what Jesus continues to do and to teach in and through the Spirit-filled church. And the Spirit-filled church is Presbyterian, and it affirms the consent of the governed.
That's a helpful way of putting it, and not just, we've heard, consent of the governed a number of times, and that those words may be an enlightenment principle, but they're drawing from biblical principles that we see time and again in the scriptures. Choose 7 men, and we will appoint them.
Yeah, Deuteronomy chapter 1, right? It's the same thing. Moses tells the children of Israel to do the same thing, to raise up leaders, experienced men. And even Moses, with all of his authority, doesn't simply do this unilaterally. The apostles don't simply do this unilaterally. Why do sessions simply do this unilaterally? What do they know that Moses and the apostles did not?
So the assistant pastor position is quite, as such in the PCA, is quite innovative, and we don't like innovation in the Reformed Church. We're against it, and it's important to remember that just because other communions have that title assistant pastor doesn't mean it's the same. That's something that we're getting into with deacons and officers, women deacons. That people will say, well, Calvin had women deacons. Well, those are not deacons as you're using the word, or
that word you keep using. I don't think it means what
yes, yes. Thank you, Mandy.
Inconceivable.
Yes, you have a dizzying intellect. But let's go there. So this is, we're up to 75 overtures now, which is not the most we've ever had. But do you think the debate on women's ordination will so fatigue the assembly that these important questions of biblical principles and their application for elders, that they'll just table this or refer it to next year? Are you optimistic that we'll get to have a good floor debate about these principles?
I hope so. I think they referred it back, and at least with respect to 39, they referred it back to us for perfection, and so we've brought it back in keeping with that reference, and so I think there's a good argument. It would be a shame if this was not given adequate time, but there's no way around the fact that there are certain debates that are more pressing and are taking more public consciousness than others. And with 75, it's going to be a challenge to give every overture its due. No question about it.
Oh, it's 75 and counting. Just you wait, Henry Higgins. Just you wait.
Yeah. I do think some of the advantage of many overtures are tweaks of sentences that I don't think will have much debate. We sent at least 3, I think, that are very minor overtures that I don't think there'll be. So there will be a lot that are that way. Obviously there will be, but it's not going to just be overtures. It's going to be RPR dealing with some of the same issues because church is being cited for some of the deaconess stuff. So there's going to be, the energy poured into that before you even get to overtures. But at the same time, like Justin said, I hope that the floor will give it, that overtures will give it attention and bring it forward positively. I suspect after what they recommended last year, and then that being retooled and refined, and then having a second one come as well, it will put more weight on the discussion. So I'm hopeful. I'm maybe more optimistic than I should be. I don't know, but I'm hopeful.
Well, it's an important issue that you raise, that we're not just doing this to tweak the polity. We're not just doing this because we don't like assistant pastors. Did you believe that there is a biblical principle that is being violated here? Just as some of the guys who are advocating for women deacons have said that they believe there are biblical principles that the PCA has wrongly interpreted the scripture in our Constitution. And so you're bringing biblical arguments to the floor in both of these issues.
Although ours is a little different. I don't know if I want to be lumped with that particular, but yeah.
Sorry, no, yeah, I apologize for that. It's just that you're making a biblical argument. You're not making
that's the same. That's the motivation is to be a biblical church. Yeah.
Yes. And we would have more time at General Assembly if guys would do a few things, and this starts at home, doesn't it? If presbyteries would follow the Constitution, we wouldn't have to have such a lengthy RPR report. If a certain brother from a certain presbytery would not pull everything out of omnibus in review of presbytery records, we would also have a little bit more time. But also, if guys wouldn't make the same argument that two guys before them made, and I'm just spitballing here. If guys would not get up to the mic and ask the question, "What are we even doing? I don't understand." Mr. Moderator, I'm so confused. So that could all save us time. Just some tips here. And so with that, how do you rate the health of the General Assembly right now? What do you think some of the takeaways from this year's PCA GA will be?
I'm bullish. I mean, again, I've never been accused of being an optimist, but I sound like one, I think. But I hope. I mean, I'm pretty critical, but
It's
I
hard
don't
not to
know.
be optimistic about the PCA right now, isn't it?
I mean, I think so. And yeah, we've got some issues coming up. Like last time I was on, and we talked about those things. But you know what? We've brought the discussion up, and people are trying to use the right mechanisms now to have these conversations, which I think is a move in the right direction. I think this particular topic, like, it's just not something that's been thought about all that much. And if nothing else, this will get people thinking more about it, because this will be the second year it's brought up. Hopefully they forget my appearance last year at General Assembly and we just move forward. But it's
He looks
I
good
You were at
on the
General Assembly last
jumbotron,
year?
people. Yeah.
yeah. I tried to get Overture 10 some attention on the floor, and apparently made some out of a court, not a court, what's it called, out of motions I wasn't allowed to make. But that here nor there.
You survived. I survived.
Yeah, that's right. I think though, I'm very optimistic. I think, yeah, we have, who doesn't have their problems? Like, there's no, what's the greener grass, right? Every time I hear that, I hear people disparaging the PCA and, oh, you're liberal, or you're this or that, or you guys are a mess, or whatever. I'm like, okay, but we're also way bigger than a lot of the other. Like, it takes longer for us to do stuff, sure. But I don't know. Yes, there's a lot of nasty stuff online. But there's also a lot of good, healthy conversations happening, and pastors who vote differently on things being friends, and a trajectory in conservatism, I think, for the PCA over the last however many years now. Ruling elder participation, and I don't know. I'm optimistic.
Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, the story of the church is always kind of the tale of two cities, right? It's the best of times and the worst of times all the time. And there's stuff that will just make your heart sing, and there's so many positive stories to tell about what the Lord is doing in and through the PCA. But there are problems, and we get down on our knees every week at St. Paul's and we confess to the Lord that we're a bunch of dirty, rotten scoundrels, and there's evidence of that. And then there's also just weakness, just imperfections of our weakness and frailty. But I think Sam struck the right note. We have every reason to be hopeful, because Christ loves his church, and he's not going to give up on his church. He's going to build it. And so this is all done in hope. And also, I would say, since I've said some strong things, the PCA has had this assistant pastor provision on the books for 50 years, and it's been a faithful witness.
Right.
I mean, I've been in the PCA for almost 40 years now, and and have nothing but gratitude, and have been well fed as a child, and I just could run on gratitude for another 40 years.
Well said. And I think that the fact that the PCAGA is going to have this conversation on some level about, how do we apply preliminary principle number 6 is indicative of our health. Because we have I think we have the latitude, we have the bandwidth, we have the leisure to debate this. I remember when I was pastoring in Mississippi all those years ago, and there was a Southern Baptist minister in our congregation who was between calls, which you know what that means when you're between calls. And he said, Ryan, I so envy the PCA because, when we go to conference or whatever the local-ish version was, we're fighting about Calvinism. We're fighting about how is a person saved.
Mm.
In the
Yeah, it's a
PCA,
good
you're not
perspective.
fighting about that. That you
Right.
have these
It's
things.
a luxury. Yeah.
Yeah, we agree. And even even that we're going to take up the issue of women's ordination. There were some guys from Moscow who are trying to make hay out of that. That the PCA, Rachel Den Hollander has so infected the PCA. Now they're talking about women's ordination. Well,
Yeah, that's right.
having been in the PCA for not quite 40 years, but I think that the reason we're having to talk about women's ordination is because there's so much stress and pressure on these churches and congregation sessions that have been pushing the envelope.
Mm.
That now they realize we've got to put up, shut up, or get out.
Yeah.
And this may be their swan song. I don't know. So I agree with you all. I am so optimistic about the trajectory of the PCA right now. It's a blessing to see what God has done over the last 6, 7, 8 years.
Hear, hear.
Well, Justin Borger and Samuel Brewer, thank you so much for these overtures and discussing them with me today.
Thank you, Ryan. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Ryan.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you, and I hope your appearance on this program doesn't doom your overtures. Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to support our work at promoting confessional renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.